Imagine a single date, a single journey that fundamentally reshaped the entire world, igniting transformations we're still, well, grappling with centuries later. But what if understanding that journey, and maybe the man at its center, isn't quite as simple or, straightforward as the stories we often hear? Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the fascinating, multifaceted, and often controversial legacy of Christopher Columbus. Our source material isn't exactly a historical account itself, not in the usual sense. It's more like a meticulously curated guide from 1991. And it offers us this remarkable window into how different historians, right around the time they were anticipating the 500th anniversary of his voyage, were actively grappling with his profound and deeply complex impact. So this isn't just about what happened, but really about how history itself is understood, debated, and reevaluated over time.
Exactly. We're drawing from this really invaluable article by Vickie Schlene. It's titled Christopher Columbus, Bridge Between the Old and New World, published in the OAH magazine of History. And what's truly compelling about this piece is, well, it doesn't just tell us about Columbus. It serves as a kind of snapshot of the scholarly landscape in the early 1990s. It reveals the diverse viewpoints, the intellectual resources that were shaping the whole conversation as the world prepared to commemorate the quincentenary in 1992. It's a meta-analysis, really, in a way. It illustrates how historians actually do their work, how they re-examine narratives, and the very nature of historical inquiry itself. It gives us a real sense of history as this living, evolving conversation, not just a static set of facts.
And that's precisely our mission today, to unpack these various perspectives, understanding that this isn't merely about remembering dates and ships. It's about comprehending how these historical narratives are constructed, how they're challenged, and how they get reshaped over time. The article, as you just mentioned, frames Columbus as a bridge between the old and new world. That's a powerful idea, isn't it? Very evocative. So let's dive in and truly unpack what kinds of connections and what kinds of consequences emerged from this pivotal historical encounter, both the intended ones and, well, the profoundly unintended ones. We often hear about Christopher Columbus in 1492. It's almost like they're synonymous with the start of the modern world, right? Our source material immediately underscores his monumental historical footprint. It states, few men in the course of history have had such a long-lasting effect on the history of the world as Christopher Columbus. And that's not just an empty statement, is it? It's really an acknowledgement that his actions irrevocably altered global trajectories. They fundamentally reshaped entire cultures, economies, and even the very ecosystems of continents. He truly stands as this critical juncture in the narrative of our interconnected world, which is precisely why his story continues to resonate, provoke discussion, and frankly demand re-examination, even centuries later.
And the timing of this article is absolutely key. It was written specifically with that impending 500th anniversary, the quincentenary in 1992, in mind. This wasn't planned as merely an occasion for celebration, not like many earlier commemorations might have been. The article points out that the quincentenary brought with it the obligation to assess existing interpretations of the significance of the voyage and establishment of permanent links between the old and new worlds. And this raises a really important question for us, I think. What does it truly mean for historians and for us as learners to have this obligation to assess? To assess such a pivotal moment rather than just commemorating it. It implies a profound responsibility, doesn't it? To delve deeper, to scrutinize the narratives passed down through generations, and ask some difficult questions about the full, often uncomfortable spectrum of impacts, both positive and negative. It was clearly a conscious push back then to move beyond those simplistic, celebratory accounts towards a more nuanced, critical understanding, one that acknowledged the pain and the disruption that also arose from that fateful encounter.
Okay, so if this obligation to assess is paramount, how do we even begin to understand the figure at the center of it all? Christopher Columbus himself. The source brings in Helen Nader from her work, Christopher Columbus, the Hero and the Historian, and she asserts that, quote, the more we know and understand the man Christopher Columbus, the more we can understand how this nation evolved from the encounter between the old world and the new, and the great social and economic changes that historic encounter set in motion. Nader's point here is quite profound, actually, because it tightly links the individual's story, his specific motivations, his character, directly to these sweeping foundational changes that followed. The surprising implication here isn't just that Columbus was complex, which, okay, maybe we expect, but it's that understanding his personal flaws and ambitions is presented as the single most critical lens, the key to decoding something as vast and intricate as the birth of a nation and all its subsequent transformations. It really challenges that idea that grand historical forces are purely impersonal, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests this direct causal chain from one man's actions to these monumental global shifts. And what's really compelling here is Nader's strong emphasis that accurate information about Columbus and his deeds is considered the one key, her words, to understanding the voyages and their consequences. This perspective suggests that a deep dive into the individual's actions, grounded firmly in factual historical accounts, is absolutely foundational. Foundational for comprehending the vast societal and economic shifts that followed. It suggests that the true understanding isn't just in broad strokes or abstract concepts, but equally in the granular details. How one man navigated his ambitions, his beliefs, his strengths, and yes, his profound flaws amidst the immense challenges and opportunities of his time. If we connect this to the bigger picture, well, it highlights a fundamental debate in historical inquiry, right? How much does the agency of one individual genuinely shape monumental events? And how much are they just a product of their time, of the larger forces at play? Nader's perspective clearly leans towards the power of individual agency. She sees it as a crucial lens for decoding historical outcomes, arguing that the consequences we observe globally are deeply rooted in the specific actions and choices of Christopher Columbus himself.
That's a powerful idea, yeah. That understanding one man's actions can unlock centuries of history. But, okay, if understanding Columbus is so key, how do we approach that understanding, especially when the narratives around him are so layered, so complex, and often so, well, contentious? Our source points us towards approaches that actively encourage critical thinking, moving us beyond simply accepting what's presented at face value. And this is precisely where the work of educators and historians becomes truly impactful, I think, guiding us to engage with history not as some static collection of settled facts, but as this ongoing dynamic dialogue. So our deep dive highlights Bill Bigelow's article, Discovering Columbus, Rereading the Past, and it presents a series of lessons for a U.S. history class on Christopher Columbus's discovery of America. Now, what's particularly insightful about Bigelow's approach is its explicit stated purpose. It provides an approach to teaching students to evaluate critically the historical information presented in their textbooks. This is crucial because it recognizes that even authoritative sources, like textbooks, can carry inherent biases or present just a single, often simplified viewpoint. I mean, think about it. Many older textbooks might have celebrated Columbus as this unblemished hero who discovered a new world, right? Often overlooking the devastating impact on indigenous populations or the complex societies that were already there. Bigelow's lessons, as described in the source, likely prompted students to question the word discovery itself, to consider what was new and old from different perspectives, and maybe to explore primary source accounts from indigenous peoples or even contemporary European critics. It's about empowering you, the learner, to become an active participant in historical inquiry, to compare narratives, identify potential biases, and understand that historical truth is often multifaceted. It requires critical probing, not just passive acceptance.
And that immediately raises an important question, doesn't it? Why would a curriculum specifically focus on critically evaluating textbook information about Columbus back in the early 1990s? It suggests a growing societal and academic acknowledgement that those initial or common narratives, especially in introductory texts, were often incomplete, oversimplified, or even overtly biased towards a Eurocentric viewpoint. In the context of the quincentenary, there was this increasing awareness, a powerful push from indigenous communities and sympathetic scholars to challenge that prevailing celebratory discovery narrative, the one that had historically downplayed or entirely omitted the devastating impacts on indigenous populations and the profound, often tragic ecological transformations that occurred. So Bigelow's approach was, in many ways, a direct and necessary response to this pressing need for a more comprehensive, balanced, and inclusive historical understanding. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about fostering genuine historical literacy, empowering students and all of us, frankly, to go far beyond surface-level information. It powerfully demonstrates how the very act of discovering history can, and often must, involve actively rereading it. Unpacking layers of interpretation that have built up over generations, it teaches us to ask, whose story is being told here? And just as important, whose story is being left out or silenced?
Right. And this vital idea of rereading the past isn't just some isolated academic exercise either. It ties directly into the larger context that Helen Nader's work, which we discussed earlier, is part of this broader booklet titled The Voyages of Columbus, a Turning Point in World History. This compilation itself, created in the lead up to 1992, powerfully underscores that even then, the narrative around Columbus was already undergoing significant re-examination. It was moving far beyond a simplistic discovery story to embrace a much more nuanced understanding of his impact as a turning point. Okay. That very phrase, a turning point in world history, suggests a recognition of profound, irreversible change, doesn't it? A historical moment from which there was really no going back, not just an isolated event of exploration. It acknowledges that Columbus's voyages weren't just some footnote in European expansion. They were a pivotal moment that fundamentally redirected the course of human civilization on a truly global scale. This compilation, bringing together various scholarly perspectives, it really highlights the growing consensus back then that the traditional narratives needed to be expanded, challenged, to truly grasp the monumental and often painful shifts initiated by 1492. Okay, so when we talk about Columbus bridging worlds, it's far more than just ideas, cultures, or even people meeting. Our sources reveal it was also this massive, unprecedented exchange of life itself. Plants, animals, diseases. And here's where it gets really compelling, I think, because our source points us squarely to the extensive and frankly foundational work of Alfred W. Crosby. His research peels back the layers of purely human-centric historical accounts to reveal these immense, often invisible biological forces at play. This isn't just about ships and explorers anymore. It's about seeds and microbes, animals and plants, crossing oceans, and fundamentally altering the very biology of continents.
It's exactly. Crosby is cited for multiple groundbreaking contributions, but most notably the Columbian voyages, the Columbian exchange, and their historians. This monumental work assesses the Columbian influence on the Old and New Worlds across several critical, often overlooked dimensions. He meticulously discusses its intellectual, economic, nutritional, and demographic effects. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about grasping the sheer totality of the impact, a comprehensive understanding that extends far beyond just exploration and conquest. Intellectually, yeah, it involved the collision and blending of vastly different worldviews, mapping new geographies and explosion in scientific knowledge, but also the tragic loss of indigenous knowledge systems. Economically, it sparked vast new global trade routes, introduced entirely new commodities, think silver, sugar fundamentally reshaping global markets, often leading to brutal systems like the transatlantic slave trade to fuel these new economies. Nutritionally, well, it introduced revolutionary food crops to both hemispheres. Potatoes, maize, tomatoes going to the Old World, profoundly altering diets, fueling population growth, reshaping agriculture worldwide. While things like wheat, sugar, and various livestock came to the New World, transforming landscapes and indigenous ways of life. And demographically, as we'll get into, it led to massive, often devastating population shifts and declines. Crosby's genius really was to weave these seemingly disparate threads, intellectual, economic, nutritional, demographic, into a single, cohesive narrative of profound planetary transformation. He'd look at how continents became interwoven in these complex and lasting ways, changing life on Earth forever.
And those demographic shifts that Crosby highlights are, well, truly staggering when you dig into them. Our source specifically points to his review of the old legacy of the Columbian exchange in terms of its effects on world population and ethnic composition. So what does this all mean for how we understand the very fabric of global society today and the diverse populations across the Americas? It's easy to think of population changes just in terms of large-scale human migrations, people moving from one place to another. But Crosby's work forces us to consider the more subtle yet equally profound ways that human groups mingled, mixed, and yes, devastatingly dwindled as a direct result of this exchange. He explores how new genetic lines form through intermarriage and often forced unions, how existing societies were either bolstered by new resources or tragically decimated by disease and conflict. The very definition of ethnic composition became this dynamic concept, not static at all, creating the multicultural tapestry we see across nations in the Americas, the Caribbean, even parts of Europe and Africa today. The legacy of these immense shifts is visible everywhere, really, in our interconnected global demographic reality. It just illustrates how deeply intertwined our present is with the events that began back in 1492.
But Crosby goes even deeper than that. He introduces this concept he terms ecological imperialism, which he detailed meticulously in another of his foundational papers. He argues quite powerfully that the greatest impact of his discoveries on the New World has been the one which the least attention has been paid, the biological impact. Which raises that important question again. Why was this biological impact so often overlooked for so long, despite its profound consequences? Part of the reason, as Crosby suggests, is that it's less visibly dramatic than, say, battles or treaties. It's a silent, almost unseen invasion that unfolds over decades, centuries even. Yet its effects are arguably more fundamental and long-lasting than many political or economic shifts. It highlighted the significant blind spot in traditional historical analysis that Crosby really sought to illuminate, forcing historians to expand their lens beyond just human agency, to include the vast, often unseen forces of nature and biology that also fundamentally shape human history. He showed that history isn't just made by kings and conquerors, right? It's also profoundly shaped by microbes and weeds, dramatically changing the physical and biological world that humans inhabit.
Okay, let's really unpack these specific biotas that Columbus imported to the New World, as Crosby details them, because they truly paint a picture of ecological upheaval and transformation. First, we have weeds. These seemingly innocuous plants, often carried inadvertently, in ship ballast or maybe stuck on clothing, at times crowded out native flora. Just imagine the devastating ripple effect this must have had on local ecosystems and indigenous agriculture. These weren't just a nuisance. Plants like various thistles, dandelions, European grasses, they were aggressive colonizers. They often grew faster, were more resistant to grazing, adapted quickly to disturbed soils. They outcompeted indigenous plant life that had evolved over millennia. Altered soil compositions disrupted the delicate balance of ecosystems. This could lead to a decline in native food sources for both humans and animals, fundamentally changing the very basis of indigenous economies and subsistence. For communities reliant on specific native plants for food, medicine, or spiritual practices, the rapid spread of foreign weeds represented a profound disruption to their whole way of life. Then, there's the introduction of domesticated animals. The source points specifically to animals like horses, cattle, and pigs. These creatures, utterly foreign to the Americas before Columbus, they fundamentally changed New World landscapes, transportation, farming practices, and even the indigenous way of life itself. Horses, for example, they revolutionized hunting, warfare, and travel for some indigenous groups, particularly on the Great Plains. But their grazing habits also severely impacted delicate grasslands and competed with native herbivores for forage. Cattle and pigs, often unconstrained by natural predators, multiplied rapidly into these massive feral populations. They rooted up native vegetation, compacted fragile soils with their hooves, spread new parasites, contaminated water sources. Their sheer numbers and impact on the environment were transformative, leading to widespread soil erosion, destruction of native forests, dramatic shifts in resource availability. This irrevocably altered the continent's agricultural potential and its ancient biodiversity, creating a new, sort of Europeanized landscape within the Americas. And finally, perhaps the most devastating aspect of this biological exchange, Old World diseases. The source explicitly lists smallpox, measles, and malaria as diseases brought over. These new pathogens had catastrophic and rapid effects on indigenous populations who had absolutely no prior immunity. Just try to imagine communities completely isolated from these diseases for thousands of years. Their immune systems simply had no defense. When a single infected European arrived, these diseases could sweep through populations like wildfire, leading to widespread death and this immense demographic collapse. It wasn't just a few isolated outbreaks, it was a series of relentless epidemics that often preceded and paved the way for European conquest, sometimes wiping out 90% or even more of entire populations before Europeans even physically arrived in significant numbers. The sheer scale of this mortality is almost unimaginable. A silent, invisible invasion that decimated societies, shattered social structures, extinguished languages and culture, and profoundly weakened any resistance to subsequent European colonization. It's a stark, tragic reminder of the unintended, often horrific, biological consequences of global interconnectedness, making the human toll of the Columbian Exchange truly immeasurable.
And what's truly compelling here is how Crosby pushes us to think beyond just those immediate human interactions, the battles, the treaties, the trade routes, to consider the profound long-term ecological and biological transformations. This wasn't merely about establishing new trade networks or shifting political power. It was about fundamentally reshaping the planet's biology and the very composition of its inhabitants. The introduction of non-native species, both plant and animal, created entirely new ecosystems. Some thrived, sure, but others led to the extinction of countless native species. The concept of ecological imperialism powerfully underlines that the European advantage in colonization wasn't solely due to their technology or military prowess or even economic systems. It was also significantly due to this unseen biological entourage they inadvertently or sometimes deliberately brought with them. This biological advantage allowed European species, including humans, to flourish, often at the direct expense of indigenous life forms. It's a powerful reminder that historical events have ripple effects across all aspects of life, often in ways that are not immediately obvious. And that the environment itself is a crucial active participant in historical narratives, not just some passive backdrop. Understanding this massive biological exchange is absolutely essential for grasping the full, complex picture of post-1492 world history and how it continues to shape our present.
Right. So to make these vast, almost abstract concepts of historical reevaluation and ecological exchange a bit more concrete, our source offers a specific geographical example: the island of Jamaica. It gives us a tangible, localized look at how these grand narratives actually played out on the ground, away from the discussions of entire continents. The article references Benjamin F. Richardson Jr.'s work, Jamaica on Early Maps, and it notes that Columbus sighted Jamaica during his second voyage in 1494, and, notably, was marooned there for more than a year during his fourth voyage, starting in 1503. So this wasn't just a fleeting visit or a brief stopover, it was a significant, prolonged, and intensely personal experience for him. For over a year, Columbus and his men were stranded, forced to contend daily with the harsh realities of the island: its limited resources, its potentially hostile indigenous inhabitants, the constant threat of starvation and disease. This intimate, albeit incredibly challenging interaction paints a very different picture than a mere discovery from afar, doesn't it? It must have profoundly shaped his understanding, or maybe his ongoing misunderstanding, of the New World, forcing him into this direct, intense engagement with the land and its people far beyond what typical explorers might have experienced. It really makes you wonder how that prolonged, difficult period influenced his later perspectives.
It does. And what's truly fascinating here is how Richardson's analysis of the succession of early maps of Jamaica betrays its slow development and its unimportance to early colonizers. Okay. So despite Columbus's direct, prolonged, and often desperate presence on the island, Jamaica didn't immediately fit that gold narrative, the narrative that primarily drove early European exploration and settlement across the Americas, which raises an important question, I think. What does this particular case tell us about the core motivations of early European powers in the New World, and how certain lands were valued or dismissed based on immediate perceived wealth? Jamaica, initially lacking the easily extractable gold or silver found elsewhere, like Mexico or Peru, was largely relegated to this secondary status in the grand imperial scheme for decades. Despite its fertile lands, abundant water, strategic location in the Caribbean, it really highlights the intensely narrow extractive focus of much of the early European engagement with the Americas, where the intrinsic long-term value of a place, its agricultural potential, its biodiversity, its indigenous cultures, was often just overlooked in favor of quick economic returns. Primarily precious metals. It underscores how the very definition of importance was skewed by the prevailing economic desires of the time, dictating which lands were prioritized and which were left to a slow development.
And the source concludes this point with a truly insightful and, well, wonderfully ironic observation. Modern tourism is the elusive gold which Spanish fortune hunters did not find. That's a beautiful, almost poetic connection, isn't it? The true long-term economic value of the land, from a purely exploitative standpoint anyway, only emerged centuries later, and in a completely different form than what the Spanish were so desperately seeking. So what does this all mean for understanding how perspectives on wealth, resources, even national interests have dramatically evolved since 1492? It's a powerful testament to how human definitions of value can change so dramatically over time. What was once seen as nearly worthless by Spanish conquistadors because it lacked a specific precious metal became incredibly valuable as global economies shifted away from raw material extraction towards service industries, leisure, the commodification of natural beauty, and cultural heritage. This transformation highlights the dynamic nature of economic perception and reminds us that historical impact isn't always immediate or obvious. The gold sought by the Spanish was tangible, finite, fleeting. The gold of tourism is experiential, potentially sustainable, and a testament to Jamaica's enduring allure, recognized centuries after its discovery. It just illustrates how radically different our measures of prosperity have become.
Exactly. This specific example of Jamaica is incredibly illustrative because it shows how those grand historical narratives often miss crucial localized experiences, and the long, slow burn of historical development that eventually reveals entirely different kinds of value or impact. It shows that what was considered gold in one era might be something entirely different in another, underscoring that our understanding of a place's historical significance is never static. It forces us to appreciate that history isn't just about the major turning points that were immediately recognized as such, but also about the quiet, often overlooked evolutions of places, cultures, economies that eventually reveal their own profound significance. It reminds us that economic value, strategic importance, cultural meaning, these are not fixed attributes. They're constantly reevaluated, redefined, revealed by successive generations and changing global contexts. It's a powerful reminder that history, in many ways, is truly ongoing, still being written, still being understood.
So we've journeyed through quite a few different lenses on Christopher Columbus today, from his individual, very complex role as a bridge between worlds, to the vast, often overlooked ecological shifts he set in motion, and even the ironic, centuries-long development of a specific island like Jamaica that he encountered. It's abundantly clear that 1492 wasn't just a date in a textbook. It was the ignition point for a global transformation that continues to unfold and shape our present in countless ways.
Absolutely. And what's truly compelling here, I think, is how these sources, especially Schlene's insightful meta-analysis from 91, compel us to view historical figures and events not as static, settled facts, but as dynamic subjects of ongoing interpretation and rigorous reevaluation. That obligation to assess, to critically reread, to diligently consider profound biological, demographic, economic effects, it provides a much richer, more complete understanding than just the simplified narratives we might initially encounter. It's about acknowledging the multiple truths, the diverse perspectives that make up any historical event, understanding that history is rarely, if ever, monolithic. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it profoundly underscores the vital importance of a multifaceted approach to history, one that acknowledges its inherent complexities, its numerous, sometimes contradictory narratives, and the diverse, often unnoticed impacts that are frequently left out of simpler tellings. It teaches us that true historical understanding comes from continuously questioning, exploring beyond the obvious, and connecting disparate pieces of information to form a more complete, albeit often challenging, mosaic.
So, considering all of this, the enduring complex legacy, the ongoing reevaluations, and the massive, sometimes invisible exchanges, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other historical discoveries or encounters might you need to critically reevaluate? What other bridges between worlds, perhaps less obvious than Columbus's, have had profound, overlooked effects that are still shaping our present right now in ways we might not even realize? It certainly gives you something powerful to mull over. That's our deep dive for today. Thanks so much for joining us.